Today, we will be exploring the scientific history and basis of the idea of human race. But first, let's look at how we exactly classify ourselves by races. The concept was formally introduced during the Enlightenment period in Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries, when scientists were attempting to group people based on geographical location or differences in physical and cultural characteristics, thus the beginning of separate races. One of the main scientists who proposed the concept of human races was German scientist Johann Blumenbach. From his experiment, he divided humans into 5 different races, which are Caucasian, Mongolian, Ethiopian, American, and Malayan, which regions that correspond to each race are put on this slide. Even though he concluded that there are 5 different racial categories, he said that the differences in our appearances were due to geographical location and that no race is inferior or superior to another. By extension, he also used these findings to reject the institution of slavery entirely, which was quite widespread during this time period as humans discriminated on the basis of human race. Blumenbach's work has given rise to further scientific discussion about human race. One of the scientists who explored this concept was Samuel Morton. Using Blumenbach's general methods with human skulls, he stuffed the skulls with pepper seeds and later lead pellets, which he then counted to determine the volume of the brain case or cranial cavity. However, he not only believed that humans can be divided into these 5 races, but also that these races could also be ranked by intelligence based on the cranial cavity's volume. The bigger volume that it had, the more intelligent the race was. He concluded from most intelligent to least intelligent that Caucasians were the most intelligent, following Mongolians, Malayans, Americans, and then lastly ranked Ethiopians on the basis of intelligence. This experiment is one of the earliest examples of scientific racism. So, what exactly is scientific racism? Scientific racism is a pseudoscientific belief that there is evidence to support or justify racial inferiority or racial superiority. Unfortunately, Morton's experiment has been used to further justify the enslavement of Africans and the unethical treatment of Native Americans. However, more recently, a University of Pennsylvania study concluded in 2018 that although Morton accurately measured the brain size of the skulls, the integrity of his scientific conclusions was plagued with racial bias, thus rendering his experiment a conclusion of pseudoscience. So, what does science actually have to say about racism? Since the scientific discussion about human races has been tainted by scientific racism, it's important to analyze this question, especially in the context of a world full with discrimination. With the rise of genetic technology and genome splicing, we're able to look at this concept at a deeper level, beyond the mere surface level differences in our physical and cultural characteristics. In 2003, scientists completed the Human Genome Project, allowing the examination of human ancestry and races with genetics through following the migration of humans across the world throughout history. By looking at this human migration map, we can see that human life started in Africa about 300,000 years ago. But about 120,000 years ago, humans began to move to different parts of the world and became isolated from one another, eventually founding new and separate human populations. Therefore, now that we have access to genetic data and human migration patterns, there theoretically should be another way to prove the scientific basis for human races. If there are genetic patterns that demonstrate the formation of different human groups, we would be essentially backing Blumenbach's theory that we can distinguish humans into these individual and equal racial categories. So, are there any identifiable markers in the DNA that support races as being significantly different from each other? Again, this question is deeper than the color we have on the surface layer of our skin. In fact, when we examine human races through genetics, the discussion of race becomes a lot more complicated. A landmark Stanford University study found in 2002 that humans have the same 99.9% of DNA. That means that we've been using the mere 0.1% of different DNA sequences to justify these differences between us, and in some unfortunate circumstance, discriminate other groups based on these proposed racial classifications. However, what's especially important to recognize is that since chimpanzees are also genetically similar to humans in DNA, they're clearly biologically different. Therefore, we should also be looking at the study-specific findings. The scientists examined over 4,000 alleles or variations in our genes of humans from all different regions and proposed races and found that only 7.4% of alleles were specific to one geographical region, and that only 1% of humans actually express them, which isn't nearly enough to formally and measurably justify a trend in different racial classifications. Since there's such a lack of actually unique region-specific genes, the study shows that there isn't enough scientific data to be actually able to classify humans into these separate groups, unlike what Blumenbach and Morton have said. Essentially, we truly aren't different enough to fundamentally label ourselves as completely different human races. So let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. When looking at people from different parts of the world, it is clear that they do share distinguishable region-specific physical features. These are caused by random mutations that occurred after humans migrated and made these isolated populations. As humans adapted and survived in their environment, they reproduced with the characteristics that helped with their survival, such as skin color, which I mentioned in a previous video. This is an example of natural selection. However, although these differences may appear significant, the genetic evidence directly indicates that there are not any identifiable markers in our DNA that would separate us into the distinct races that are fundamentally different from one another. So, why do we continue to classify by races if it has a questionable scientific basis? The reason is that even though the term race tends to have a negative connotation due to theories like Morton's, classifications based on ancestry are advantageous in some circumstances. For example, because we generally accept these racial classifications in our society, by keeping track of this racial information, these classifications can ensure that each labeled population is being fairly treated and represented. For example, if we didn't have this information in the first place, we wouldn't be able to identify the trend that there has been a huge increase in the number of hate crimes against South Asians and Arab Americans since September 11th, 2001, or 9/11. So gathering this information on certain racial groups has also helped with not only representing communities, but has also helped with identifying public health trends. There's actually some evidence that certain diseases and medical conditions are more prevalent in some racial groups that we currently use to classify others today. Namely, sickle cell anemia is most common among sub-Saharan Africans. Having this sort of understanding that's based on this racial data can help us further medical treatments and actually target the groups that need these treatments the most. So overall, I hope I gave you some insight into human races and that it just isn't a matter of skin color. By examining the science, we can see that racial discrimination is even more misguided, since humans are actually extremely similar to the point where there really isn't a justification to separate us into these fundamentally different racial groups in the first place. Thank you for watching, and make sure to keep your eyes out for the next video.